All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we are diving headfirst into UK criminal law.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, but trust me, it's way more interesting than you might think. And to make sure we all stay on the same page, we're going to be focusing on one specific concept, mens rea. You ever heard of that?
I have. Yeah, it's basically the mental state you need to have to be found guilty of a crime, right?
Exactly. Like, is it enough to just do something wrong, or does the law actually care what you were thinking at the time?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Are our thoughts alone enough to get us into trouble? And can you be guilty even if you didn't actually mean to cause any harm?
Ooh, that's a good stuff to unpack there.
That is why we are here today, to answer those very questions. We'll be using excerpts from Podcast 3 UK Law podcasts as our guide. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in.
I always like to start with the basics. Can you give us a quick definition of mens rea? In simple terms, what does it really mean?
Sure. Mens rea is, well, it's the mental element of a crime. See, it's not enough to just do something bad. The law also considers what was going on in your mind when you did it. And that's super important because it helps separate genuine accidents from deliberate crimes.
Makes sense. So, like, if I'm running down the street and I
Yeah,
accidentally bump into you, that's different from if I just came up and shoved you on purpose.
exactly. Same physical act, but totally different intention behind it.
So that intention is key.
Absolutely. And this is where the different types of mens rea come into play.
Ooh, so our source mentions a few of these types. Direct intention, oblique intention, recklessness, and negligence. Let's break those down. What about direct intention? What does that look like?
Direct intention is probably the most straightforward one. It's like, picture someone aiming a gun and pulling the trigger.
With the goal of killing someone, right?
Exactly. Their purpose is to cause that specific outcome. They wanted to kill, and they did.
Okay, that one is pretty clear cut. But what about situations where the outcome isn't quite so direct? Like, let's say someone needs to stop a runaway train and decides to blow up a bridge, but they know there's a worker on that bridge. They intend to stop the train, but they also know that worker's death is a likely outcome. How does mens rea play into that?
Okay, so that is a great example, and that takes us into the territory of oblique intention. The primary goal might be to stop the train, but they can foresee the worker's death as a consequence of their actions.
So even though killing the worker isn't their main goal, they still sort of intended it because it was pretty much guaranteed to happen.
Right. It gets a little murky, but oblique intention looks at those foreseen consequences and how the law considers them intentional, even if they weren't the primary goal.
It reminds me of all those movies where the villain sets up some elaborate trap and someone ends up dying even though they weren't the direct target.
Yeah.
The law has to have a way to deal with those situations, right?
It does, and it tries to stay ahead of those crafty villains. But let's move on to another type of mens rea, and that's recklessness.
Okay.
This one can be even trickier.
Ooh.
Our source actually gives a real-life example that sparked a lot of debate, the case of RVG and another, where two young boys accidentally started a fire that caused a lot of damage.
So they didn't intend to cause the fire.
No, but their actions were considered reckless because a reasonable person would have understood the risk involved.
So with recklessness, it's about understanding the possible consequences, but still taking the risk anyway, even if you didn't want the bad outcome.
Exactly. And this particular case raised a lot of questions about how we hold children accountable for actions they may not fully grasp the implications of.
Right, because the boy's age and mental capacity definitely make things way more complicated. It seems like mens rea can be very subjective when you consider those factors.
Absolutely. Every case is different, and that's what makes studying law so interesting.
I can see that. So, we've covered direct intention, oblique intention, and recklessness. But what about negligence? Where does that fit in?
Ah. Negligence is interesting because it shifts the focus away from your mental state at the time of the act and looks more at what a reasonable person would have done in the same situation.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're driving while drowsy and cause an accident, you might not have intended to hurt anyone, but a reasonable person would have recognized the risk and pulled over.
So, even if you didn't consciously set out to cause harm, you can still be held accountable if you don't meet that reasonable person standard.
Precisely. And that standard is a key concept in lots of legal cases, especially when it comes to things like accidents or malpractice.
Okay, I'm starting to get the bigger picture now. We've got intention, both direct and oblique, recklessness, and negligence. Those seem to be the big players in the mens rea game.
You got it. And each represents a different level of blameworthiness.
This has been really helpful. But before we go any further, I want to touch on something Our source material emphasized the importance of timing when it comes to mens rea. What exactly do they mean by that?
Oh, that's a crucial point. For a crime to actually occur, both the actus reus, that's the physical act of the crime, and the mens rea, the guilty mind, have to exist at the same time.
Hmm. So just thinking about doing something wrong, even something really bad, isn't enough to make you a criminal.
Exactly. Thoughts alone can't make us criminals. It's our actions, paired with the required mental state at the time of those actions, that determine if we've actually crossed the line.
Phew. Good to know. To illustrate this, our source material has a pretty fascinating example. They say to imagine someone hates their neighbor and is planning to kill them. But before they can carry out their plan, they accidentally hit that same neighbor with their car.
No, that is a perfect example. Even though they had the intent to kill beforehand, the accident wouldn't be considered murder because the mens rea, that intent to kill, didn't happen at the same time as the act of hitting them with the car.
Wow, so even though the outcome is the same, the legal consequences are totally different.
You see how tricky it can get.
I do.
And that's just scratching the surface.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the different types of mens rea to the importance of timing. This notion of a guilty mind is way more complex than I realized.
It really is.
But I feel like we've only just dipped our toes into this fascinating world of UK criminal law.
That's true. We've only just begun.
There is so much more to explore, and when we come back, we'll dive into some even trickier concepts, like transferred malice and strict liability.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Don't go anywhere, folks. There's much more to come.
Welcome back, folks. Now, before the break, we were talking about how important it is for the actus reus and the mens rea to happen at the same time.
Right, like they have to perfectly line up.
Exactly. But what happens when you set out to hurt one person, but end up harming someone else completely by accident? Like, does the law have any way to deal with those kinds of situations?
Yeah, it's like a classic movie trope, right? Mistaken identity or those unintended consequences, the whole bit. How does mens rea come into play when things don't go according to a plan?
Well, that's where this idea of transferred malice comes in. It's like the law recognizing that, well, intent can be a bit messy sometimes. Picture this. Someone takes a shot at person A,
Okay.
but their aim is off and they accidentally hit person B instead.
So the intent to harm, to kill even, is like transferred over to this unintended victim.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Even though person B wasn't the original target, the law says that mens rea, that intent to kill person A, can be transferred over. So legally speaking, it's like they did intend to harm the person they actually ended up harming.
That's kind of a mind-blowing concept.
It is, isn't it? It ensures that someone who sets out to cause harm doesn't get off scot-free just because their aim was off.
Right, it keeps things fair.
Exactly. But of course, there are limits to this principle.
I was just thinking that. Like, what if, in that same scenario, the bullet misses everyone and ends up shattering a shop window instead? Does the intent to kill get transferred to property damage?
Good question. And that's where the limitations come in. Transferred malice only really works within the same category of crime. So you can't transfer an intent to kill onto, say, a charge of property damage.
So the person who fired the shot might be in trouble for criminal damage or something.
Exactly, but not attempted murder. Remember, for a crime to be a crime, that mens rea still has to match up with the actus reus. You can't just go swapping intent between completely different types of crimes.
So transferred malice is like this legal mechanism that makes sure the punishment fits the intent even when things go sideways.
Yeah.
But it's not a free-for-all to just shift intent wherever you want.
Exactly. It keeps things balanced. But now, that brings us to another interesting aspect of UK criminal law. There are certain situations where mens rea isn't always required to be found guilty.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying you can be guilty of a crime even if you didn't have a guilty mind? That doesn't sound fair at all.
I know, right? It seems counterintuitive, but these are what we call strict liability offenses.
Strict liability.
Yeah, and they exist for specific reasons, often in cases where public safety is the top priority. Think of things like speeding or driving without insurance.
Okay, so even if I genuinely didn't realize I was over the speed limit, or if I totally spaced on renewing my insurance, I could still be held responsible.
That's the thing with strict liability offenses. In these cases, just doing the act itself is enough to be found guilty. What you were thinking or intending, it doesn't really come into play.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a bit frustrating for people. But why do these strict liability offenses even exist? What's the logic behind them?
Well, it's all about creating clear boundaries when it comes to safety regulations.
So, like, if everyone could just say, oh, I didn't know I was speeding, or I forgot about my insurance, it would be pretty hard to enforce those rules that are meant to keep everyone safe.
Right. It's a way of making sure people take those rules seriously. It's about prioritizing the greater good, even if it means that in some cases, individuals might feel like their intentions weren't fully considered.
It's like the law is saying, we can't risk letting people off the hook just because they say they didn't mean to break the rules, especially when it comes to public safety.
Exactly. The stakes are just too high in those situations.
Our source material did mention, though, that not all strict liability offenses are treated equally.
Ah, good point.
There are different levels of
You have to
strictness.
get it. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. There's actually a distinction between what we call offenses of absolute liability and those that just don't require mens rea for certain parts of the offense.
Okay, I'm curious now. What's the difference between absolute liability and, like, regular strict liability? They both sound pretty strict to me.
So, offenses of absolute liability are usually those less serious, more regulatory offenses where no mens rea is needed at all. Like, it doesn't matter what you were thinking, what your intention was, or even what you knew. If you did the act, you're guilty.
So those are like the no excuses offenses, no
Yeah.
matter what.
The classic example is selling alcohol to a minor. Even if you check their ID and genuinely believe they were old enough, or if someone tricked you, the very act of selling the alcohol means you're responsible.
Okay, so those are the really serious ones. But what about the other type of strict liability, where mens rea isn't always a factor? How does that work?
Well, with those, there might be some elements of the crime that do require mens rea to be proven, while others don't. It's not a complete disregard for the defendant's mental state, but more of a nuanced approach, depending on the specific offense and the potential harm involved.
So it's like a sliding scale of strictness, depending on the situation.
Yeah.
It's not always as straightforward as, did you have a guilty mind or not?
Exactly. And it's up to the courts to figure out where on that scale a particular offense falls, taking into account all the details of the case.
That makes sense. So even within this idea of strict liability, there's still room for interpretation and legal debate.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying law so fascinating, you know? It's not just about black and white rules. There are always those gray areas to consider, those competing interests that need to be balanced.
It's definitely more complex than I initially thought.
Definitely. It is. Definitely. But hey, even though strict liability can seem tough, it makes sense when you think about it. Especially in situations where public safety is the main concern, it's about setting those clear boundaries.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier, like with speeding or driving without insurance. Those are classic examples. It's about making sure people are extra careful and follow those rules, even if they didn't intend to break them.
Right. Because imagine if anyone could just say, oops, I didn't realize I was speeding, or I totally forgot about my insurance. Those rules would be impossible to enforce.
Right, it would be chaos.
Exactly. So strict liability is about prioritizing the safety of everyone, even if it means that sometimes an individual might feel like, hey, my intention should matter here.
It's like choosing the greater good over individual circumstances in certain cases.
Exactly. It's about drawing that line in the sand and saying, look, these rules are non-negotiable. Public safety comes first.
I get it. But I do remember our source material mentioning that not all strict liability offenses are treated exactly the same. Like there are different levels of strictness.
Ah, you remembered. Yeah, you're right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing when it comes to strict liability. There's actually a difference between what we call offenses of absolute liability and those that just don't require mens rea for certain elements of the crime. It's a spectrum, really.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What's the difference between absolute liability and regular strict liability? Because they both sound pretty strict to me.
All right, so offenses of absolute liability are usually those less serious, more regulatory types of offenses where, get this, absolutely no mens rea is needed. Like, at all. It doesn't matter what you were thinking, what your intentions were, or even what you knew at the time. If you committed the act, boom, you're guilty, no questions asked.
Wow, no way out of that one. So those are the serious no excuses offenses then.
You got it. No excuses. The textbook example is selling alcohol to a minor. Even if you checked their ID and thought they were old enough, or if someone flat out tricked you, the simple fact that you sold the alcohol to a minor is enough to hold you responsible.
That's a powerful example. But what about those other strict liability offenses where mens rea isn't always required? How do those work?
Well, those are a little different. In those cases, there might be some parts of the crime that actually do require mens rea to be proven, while others don't. It's not about completely ignoring the person's state of mind, but rather taking a more nuanced approach, kind of picking and choosing which elements need that mens rea element.
So it's not black and white then. It's more like shades of gray, depending on the specifics of the offense.
Exactly. And it's up to the courts to figure out, based on the law itself and the circumstances of the case, where that particular offense lands on the spectrum of strictness. They have to weigh things like the potential harm to the public, what the lawmakers intended when they wrote the law, and whether having that strict liability element would actually encourage people to follow the rules.
It sounds like a lot for the courts to consider. So even within this concept of strict liability, there's still room for legal debate and different interpretations, right?
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so fascinating, don't you think? It's not just about following a set of rigid rules. There are always those gray areas, those competing interests that the legal system has to grapple with.
It's definitely more complex than I initially thought.
It always is.
Well, this whole discussion has been incredibly eye-opening. We've covered so much ground, from the different types of mens rea to the whole idea of transferred malice and now these nuances of strict liability. I feel like I have a much better grasp of how mens rea, this guilty mind concept, really works in UK criminal law.
I'm glad to hear that, because it really is a crucial element of the law. It's not just about what you do, but also what's going on in your head when you do it. And as we've seen, sometimes even your state of mind might not be enough to avoid being held responsible.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. Individual rights versus protecting society as a whole. It's a constant balancing act.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Who knows, maybe one of us will be arguing a case in front of the Supreme Court someday, armed with all this knowledge about mens rea.
Maybe. But until then, let's keep those brains engaged, keep asking those curious questions. There's always more to learn and explore.
That's the truth. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time.